Welcome to today's webinar, Democracy, a New Idea for Government, to do with, not for, brought to you by our ABCD Community of Practice. I wish to recognize the long history of the First Nations and the Métis people in Ontario, and show respect today to the communities of the Six Nations of Grand River Territory and the Mississauga of New Credit. As we begin our webinar, it is important that we see this acknowledgement as a starting position. Our work in community building and developing vibrant communities is strengthened when we use a lens towards reconciliation. And our work is hindered when we don't consider the implications of colonialism within our communities. Canada's colonial history and its ongoing struggles with reconciliation and racism are part of our communities. Recognizing this allows us to develop more inclusive and enriching programs that support reconciliation with all peoples can benefit from our shared prosperity. Democracy can be defined as the Greek words demos, meaning people, and kratos, meaning power. And when you put that together, democracy is about the power of people. Power of people is not about a check mark on a ballot. It's not about finding services or organizations to deal with problems, and it's not about blaming others. It's about people and communities coming together to solve a problem, and governing organizations supporting people by convening these groups and listening. John McKnight writes an article that when governments or any large institutions take over communities' function, the power is relocated, and institutions grow stronger as the community loses power and become more dependent. Today, John McKnight will be having a discussion with David Mathews from the Kettering Foundation, who wrote a book called With the People, An Introduction to an Idea. David's book takes us on a learning journey to understand what has shifted in our views of democracy, trust, confidence, and roles, and how a with strategy could be the solution to strengthen democracy. I would now like to introduce to you David Mathews, who is the president and CEO of the Kettering Foundation and directs the studies of the Foundation's Cousins Research Group. I'd also like to welcome John McKnight, who is the founder and co-director of the Assetbased Community Development Institute.
All right, there we are. Thanks. Glad to be here with Tamarack Institute because in North America, at least, it is the most influential and comprehensive organization in support of strong communities that I know of. And this is a wonderful gathering today because I learned from you, Heather, that there are people here from at least 9 countries, good many from Canada and some from the United States, but people as far away as New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, Norway. So we have a wonderful, wonderful gathering of people of concern and commitment. I have known Dr. David Mathews for a good many years, and he has a very significant background that I think has influenced how he thinks today. So, Dr. Mathews, let me begin by asking you to give us a brief history, but a history that sets the context from which your book With grew, and then tell us a bit more about Kettering and how it relates to the with question. So, welcome.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, a historian, I'm with Kettering. We are a research institute started by inventors. And that's very important because the kind of research inventors do is not the kind academics do. It's practical research, inventors. Charles Kettering is the self-starter in your car. He lived with a group of inventors here in the area where we're located, most notably Orville and Wilbur Wright, the airplane. So I was really pleased to get the questions that Heather sent me before this meeting. Those are great questions. And I want to respond to them by telling you 3 stories. The first story is the story of Orville and Wilbur. And I was taken by the number of times that they crashed. And so I asked one of the generals in our Air Force why the Wright brothers crashed so much. And he said, it's simple. They didn't know how to fly, but they invented the airplane that does know how to fly. Now, how did they do that? They were constantly experimenting. They were very thorough experimenters. And if something didn't work, they would try it again. And now, thanks to that, we can fly around the globe. The second story is a story about a school in Tennessee that trained the leadership for the civil rights, or what the founders called the human rights movement. It was run by a guy that you know, John Miles Horton, and he tells this story. A group of union leaders came to see Miles because they were involved in a very bitter strike and they were losing. And they said, Miles, you've got to tell us what to do. And he said, no, I can't. And one of the union leaders was so exercised, he pulled out a gun and pointed at Miles and said, you're the expert here, and if you don't give me the answer, I'm going to shoot you. Miles said he hesitated a little bit, but he said, no, but let me tell you why. If I give you the answer to your question, in time, circumstances are going to change and the idea of the answer is going to be wrong. So you're going to have to get somebody else to give you the answer. And then in time, that answer will be irrelevant because circumstances have changed. And so you'll have to get somebody else, and on and on and on. I can't answer your question, but I can tell you something about how you can find your own answers. Third story is from our research. We were studying communities, and we were trying to find out why some were able to solve their problems most often, and others weren't. They couldn't even get out of the rain when it was raining. Why the difference? Well, the communities were very similar in many ways, but the ones that were good problem solvers were also like good students. I taught history for a number of years, and if you had a really good student, they'd read everything that you assigned, and then they'd go to the library and find 3 books that you hadn't read. And you couldn't stop them. They might not do too well, but they'd be back again. So the communities that were successful in solving problems more often than not were incredibly good learners. So from that point on, we began to try to understand what made for a learning community. What made for it. Now, those 3 stories are my response to your questions. And my response is, I can't answer them. I can't answer them. But nobody can answer them. And let me tell you why nobody can answer them. Research we've done that went into the book on With showed us that we've done some tests on it, and the responses on that, people love the idea. Work with one another. Sure, we should do that. All right. And then we'd say, well, having agreed, what are you going to do? And what do you know? They went back to doing exactly the same things they had done before. Why? Because they knew how to do them. But they didn't work. They didn't work. We've known for years that the citizens of the United States and the government of the United States have lost confidence in one another. And the institutions have tried all kinds of things to remedy it. Public participation programs, involvement programs, you make the budget. And not only has it not worked, loss of confidence has grown steadily while these very sincere and well-intentioned efforts have gone on. But there is some evidence now they've made it worse because people didn't mean that they wanted the institutions to give them more data or more facts. If you just did what we said and knew what we knew, you'd love what we do. Not true. People wanted a different relationship with the institutions. More than that, other things that we found led us to a simple proposition. We took President Lincoln's ideal, which is still our ideal. We should have a government of, by, and for the people. But not many people now think we have a government of the people. By the people, you got to be kidding. For the people, maybe sometimes for some people. So why not add another preposition? With. Simple idea. And we already do it. In a natural disaster, the government has wonderful relief people, but they're not the ones that save you. You live or die depending on what your neighbors do, okay? So there are some things that governments can't do, in this case, because they can't get there. And there are other things that people can do and do often do, and it makes a great deal of difference, all right? So with is not a complicated idea. It's not a bit of esoteric theory. We do it all the time, but we don't do it as a matter of policy, and we don't do it except when there is an extreme crisis, and that's all we can do. So what we've tried to understand is how we get beyond citizens as volunteers or citizens as consumers to citizens as producers. Now, when people respond enthusiastically to the notion we should do more with, when you get to talking about citizens as producers, whoa, whoa. Our institutions are not built to deal with citizens as consumers. Take higher education, for example. In higher education, citizens are the clients for the medical school. They are for the law school. They are the patients for the medical schools. Maybe that's both ways there. Citizens are customers for the business school. Citizens are the students that are to be molded and taught and instructed. But in none of these cases, and for good reason, citizens are not producers. So what would it mean for higher education to treat citizens as consumers, even the citizens that come as consumers? We don't know. Nobody knows because they weren't built to do. And that's why I can't answer the questions, the good questions that you've answered. We're not going to be able to answer those questions until we have some experiments like Orville and Wilbur's in institutions where people experiment with treating citizens as producers and citizens come to think of themselves as producers. You can't have a partnership or with strategy without two entities working together. And if citizens can't do their part of it, there's no possibility for a with strategy. So what we're trying to learn is how institutions can experiment, find better ways to treat the people they encounter as producers, and citizens find a better sense of themselves as producers, as agents who can make a difference. Now, why do I get excited by this? This is my final line. Democracy is not privileged to have eternal life. We can't think of not living in a democracy. We've lived in one, our parents, our grandparents, on back through the ages. But democracy, history shows, is very fragile. and it comes and it goes. And right now, there have been consistent warnings for years that our democracy is in real trouble, and we've paid no attention. We've paid no attention. And now there are other forms of government, authoritarian, that are able to demonstrate that they can deliver on their promises. Is democracy dying? That would be too dramatic. Is democracy in serious trouble? It is. Is more of the same going to work? It isn't. Something has to happen that's different. And that depends really fundamentally on the people who are on this call, those kind of people.
David, when you think about the fact that you said that the institutions aren't structured really to see local citizens as producers, and a lot of local people don't think that they have the power to be local producers. Can you give us your reflections on how one might begin to address those two differences that keep us from doing with well? What's what would you take as steps in your mind to begin to citizens to think they have power and institutions to think they could be involved in joint production?
Well, as you know, John, for years, particularly last century, we spent largely building large institutions and systems and paying no attention at all to community. We arrived at the end of that century and the first of the 21st, aware now that communities make a real difference. There is a high correlation between the character of a community and the quality of education that young people get. There's an even higher correlation between the nature of the community and whether people get sick and get well or die. There's a high correlation between social welfare, social well-being, and the nature of the community. Even the economy, it's not just capital, labor, and technology, it's capital, labor, technology, and community. So now we find ourselves having neglected the importance of communities with a lot of good evidence that we accept that communities are terribly important. And that's bringing about a real, revolution's too strong of it, but there's been an upsurge, as you know, in attention to communities, and people now, with particularly in the United States, with trouble at the national level, are turning more to communities for problem solving. But communities are not immune from the polarization and strife that the other parts of the political system, but the spotlight is on them. And so that's energizing efforts to make communities work better.
Now, how do you think it came about that we might have a citizenry that does not believe it has much power or capacity, even not just power, but the ability to be the producers that they can be? What led to that?
Well, as you know, the argument is made that citizens don't have any power because they're apathetic. They really don't care. They're not interested. They're off doing other things. Not true. The only apathetic people are in the cemetery. People that are still up and around care about something. They just don't care about the things that the people who want them to care for. Okay. So we have a group of leaders, well-intentioned, that want people to get involved, to get excited about the things they're excited about. And people are doing other things. They care about other things. They care about their families. They care about their jobs. They care about the people that they live around. They care, but they see no connection between what they care about and what the political system is doing. So they don't vote, they don't participate. Why should they?
Well, and so you've written a book called With,
Yeah,
which is how do we in this setting begin to do things with? What can you give us a sense of seeing this polarization between institutional structures and community doubts, right? How do we begin to make that connection so that we have a with that isn't necessarily co-production? It could be called complementary action, as you do.
yeah.
Can you tell us a little about that?
We don't have to worry about getting started. It's already started. It's already started. And I learned a lot from you and the organizing community. And I remember one fella you may run into him, J. Herman Blake, sociologist. And his strategy was build on what grows. Start where people start with what's valuable to them and build on it. And that's beginning to happen. That's beginning to happen. So our job is not to come in with something that's totally new and people haven't but to look for what is already happening and build on it. That to me is the organizing strategy for the future. It's already happening, and the things that people need, they don't think they have power and resources, but they do. It's within them. Nobody has done more to show that they have power than you do in your work. The power to form an association, the power to help somebody else, the power to just set an example by your behavior. Enormous power, the power of the knowledge that I have from everyday life. That's all power. And when people come to recognize it, they realize that democratic politics is not the politicians alone, it's them, it's in us. And once they come to that realization, they are self-empowering.
A lot of the people that are listening, I think, work with people, localities. And so you're pointing them toward the recognition among these folks that they do have power. And in that sense, it seems to me, it's an important role to understand in a local place what makes people feel powerful. And what do they see as in their interests? Sort of the starting point, you're saying. We grow from there. Is that right?
Right. Well, the starting point started a long time ago.
Time ago, yeah.
It started when our species first appeared on the planet. And we learned certain survival imperatives, and we're still motivated by them. We want to be secure from danger. We want to be free to do what we think we ought to do. We want to be treated fairly. We want enough control over our lives so that we can get these other things. Human beings have been motivated by those because those were the survival lessons. And deep within everybody's political DNA, those imperatives still work. Now, what we're trying to do at our foundation is to call on those imperatives to help people make decisions that they can work together, decide together so they can work together, learn together so that they can work together. But you start with the basics of the things, the imperatives that all human beings for thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, have been motivated by to do what you can still count on those.
David, you might want to make a plug here. I know that the Kettering Foundation has for years produced really valuable workbooks that allow people in local communities to have discussions where they come out with a informed opinions. And I wonder if you could say a few words about that and how people who are interested in communities that could engage in informed decision making could relate to Kettering. Where would they look? Which they get?
Well, there's an organization they work with called the National Issues Forum. It deals with a wide range of issues, from foreign policy to healthcare to whatever. The people who do the forums tell us the issues they want to talk about, and we devise books, because if you think about politics, politics is essentially collective decisions for collective action. So we've entered politics with collective decisions. You can't, if politics is action, then you got to make a choice. You got to make some kind of decision. So that's been an entry point. And communities have used our books, which lay out a number of options, at least 3, pros and cons. So people can't just have a nice civil discussion. They have to do the hard work of weighing various options against what's really valuable to them. And as a result, they come to more shared and reflective judgments. And this makes it possible for them not to agree, but to get to a point that their differences do not become divisive, and they can find enough common ground to work. And we used to do all of the books now, but a lot of them are done at the community level. But they're done by the National Issues Forum. There's an institute that works with them that produces the books. You can reach them by contacting us or contact them directly. They have a website on that.
National Issues Forum. And Heather, I'm sure, will send everybody with the information, that's follow-up information site where they can get to those books. They're wonderful volumes. I want to ask you another thing that seems to me to be very common in the questions that we have received. And it is this: a lot of community folks or people who work with and in communities think that a problem they have in doing something with government is the orientation that government has, which is they are a producer and the citizens are consumers or clients, right?
Right.
So they see the issue of how do you shift the viewpoint? It isn't just a program question. How do you shift the viewpoint of people in government, particularly leadership? And if I can be personal, here you were head of the United States Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. You've been at the top of one of these structures that people want to see change in viewpoint. Can you give us some advice on what changes the ideas and orientation of the leadership?
Well, I can tell you, for years, we've known that people were losing confidence in the government. And the reaction in the 70s when I was in government, well, that's too bad, but it's not that important. And besides, they wouldn't know what to do if, we listened to them. Well, that has grown and grown and grown. And right now, it's gotten to the point. Criticism's okay, opposition fine. But if the loss of confidence morphs into loss of legitimacy, the government is out of business. Okay? And now governments and non-governmental institutions, because it applies to both, are beginning in some quarters to think maybe we need to do something different. The media, for example, there's now a little movement within the media to say we can't continue to do business as usual. We've got to do something radically different to change what we're doing. So there is a little window of attention right now, because the loss of confidence and the instability is beginning to threaten. And there's some good Nobel Prize research by Elinor Ostrom that shows that even our best institutions can't be maximally effective without the complementary production of things that only citizens can produce. And in health, for example, which I know something about, we now know that human compassion is a clinically proven medicine, should I say. And the institutions, we've got good institutions of medicine that can care for you, but only other human beings can care about you. And that has a healing power. So the institutions are learning that actually without what citizens produce, they can't do their jobs effectively.
One of the things that you point out in the book is that there are certain kinds of issues and activities that the institutions are best at doing. But there are other kinds of activities that local communities and their associations tend to be best at doing. Do you have any sort of ways of recognizing the different? To me, if we could sort out the function question, that would be a good step forward. How do we begin to think about these different ways of production?
Well, we did a study for some grant-making foundations several years ago, and they wondered why giving money didn't solve the problem to take care of everything. And what we found was that the people who were really effective at the community level were all these little small grassroots associations. There's a recent study on crime, why some communities have lower crime rates than others. And it correlates to the number of associations they have. For every certain number of associations, you get a drop in crime. But knowing this, the grant makers and the governments tried to help these little grassroots organizations. But they said, well, okay, we give you some money. You got to have an accountant. And by the way, you need some bylaws. And let us train your members in how to be board members. And you have to do this. And they did to get the money. And what do you know? They became colonies of the large institution, and they lost their effectiveness. They lost their effectiveness. There's a little movie of a friend named Edgar Kahn took our research to England and had a little cartoon made of it called The Parables of the Blobs and the Squares. We had called the grassroots organizations blobs because they are not necessarily tightly structured. And we call the large institutions squares because they are. And so we know a lot now about why the grassroots associations are effective, because they've got a human touch. And we know that unfortunately that the squares, the large institutions, are going to have to find ways to relate to that.
Well, when I got done reading with, I thought this distinction was really critical, and it's the difference, I think, between complementary action and co-production. You have complementary action at the point where you understand that institutions have one set of functions and communities have another set, and their action can be complementary, and you don't have to think so much about co-production as the key.
Right. We did a book report a few years ago called The Ecology of Democracy. And it's clear that, like a natural ecosystem, that there are wetlands, and that's where all of the little forms of life live and generate. And then we have the uplands, we have large buildings. But now we know that the folks up on the hills in the big houses are very dependent on what happens down in the creeks and in the swamps and in the bayous. Now, what we have to do, those two have become unconnected. And we don't recognize that democracy is an ecosystem, and that actually the large institutions are dependent on what happens in the swampy wetlands, civic wetlands of democracy. And those two have become too distant, disconnected. And that's one of the reasons why the institutions are in trouble.
Heather, I'm wondering, we must have some questions out there at this point. Can I turn it over to you, and you can see, pose those that seem the most thematic for Dave?
I think a lot of people are sitting back and listening because there's not a whole lot of questions coming in. But there were two questions about, can you give some specific examples of what governing with the people looks like?
Yes, I can give you a very specific one. I live on a small lane, narrow lane, and we have a lot of trees, so we have leaves in the fall. But the city government has a big truck, too big to go down our lane, and it has a huge vacuum cleaner, and they can't get to our lane. So what we have to do is we have to take rakes and rake our lawns, and we pile them up at the end of the lane, and then the big truck comes down and picks them up. That's a with strategy. We do what we can do, the government then can do what it can do. Now, there are countless examples of that necessary. Right now, one of our biggest research projects, and it has been, is non-governmental diplomacy. Governments get out of sorts. They can act kind of like children, but if they have nuclear arms, that's not quite a child's play. So for 60 years with the Russians, 48 years with the Chinese, 25 years with the Cubans. We run something that only citizens can do. The governments can't talk as frankly and as freely as we can. We certainly keep the governments informed of what we're doing. But here is something that citizens can do that's absolutely critical now to keep governments supplied with fresh ideas, possibilities for cooperation, things to do that would at least offset the chances of something terrible and tragic from happening. That's a concrete example. Two concrete examples, leaves and non-governmental diplomacy.
I remember one of my professors saying that when you have a problem, you need to come with solutions. And that's what I thought about when you were talking about the raking the grass. And so a solution would, you know, when there's a problem, what is my solution to it and what can you do with it? So that's what reminded me when you were just talking about that. We have a question here about how is technology affecting democracy currently in a negative fashion, question mark?
There's an article in Atlantic this month. Does the internet have to be this bad? Or the internet doesn't have to be this bad. There really is a race on now for the use of technology, and the authoritarian governments are winning. The Chinese have a very effective internet system that's controlled by the government. The internet is used by the far right wing in the United States to wreak havoc. So what we're looking for, and what you're an example of, is the development of platforms that can be used for democratic purposes. So you're on the forefront of what needs to be done. We're trying to look at it. We're much farther behind than you are. But yes, there is a war on for the use of the internet. And right now, the democratic forces are behind.
There's another question here about if it's known that the loss of confidence can lead to a loss of legitimacy, then why do many governments feel so threatened by empowered citizens?
Well, from the government's point of view, they have difficulty because they aren't sure they can count on citizens. They've had cases where citizens are not expert. There was article in The Economist a few years ago that said, don't people realize that this world has to be run by professionals now because it's too technical, it's too expert. Citizens are hopeless amateurs. Okay. And so there is, unfortunately, some contempt for citizens that keeps them from running experiments to engage people as producers. That's still ahead on the road.
Another question is, how do we rebuild trust in our communities? And as we do this, how do we come together?
Well, I think trust comes from work. The people that you trust are the people you've had experience working with. You can count on them. You know what they will do and you know what they won't do. And trust, if people get together, maybe they don't particularly trust one another, maybe they don't even like one another, but they need one another because they can't solve the problems without them. And if they begin to make decisions together and act together, it builds trust. But without that, trust is just a wish.
A question here is about asset-based community development methodology.
Yeah.
So how is the WIS strategy different or similar to the ABCD approach?
Let John answer that.
Well, I would say it isn't different at all. ABCD says that there are 6 basic building blocks that communities use when they want to solve problems. And one of them is local associations and the associational life. And another is the institutions that are very local. When you look very locally, there are lots of opportunities, it seems to me, for a local library, a local school, a local fire station, a local post office to relate effectively with local people, and the people who are professionals there are usually respected. The problem, I think, begins when you get to scale, when you get too big, when you get too many people in something called an institution, that it has no personal life. When we say we want to institutionalize something, what we mean is we want to create something that will go on regardless of who's in it, right? The institution has a life of its own. Well, in the associational and community world, it's the reverse. Who's in it is absolutely critical, and the personal nature is what it thrives on. So the reason I think Bay's insights about function are so important is that institutions do have important roles and neighborhoods do have important roles. And if they each recognize their part of the job, then there's very little conflict and trust develops because they are working together. And so ABCD tries to give a sense that here are the pieces that if we can connect them, will make our neighborhood much better than it is. Every story we have collected, and we have thousands of them, about what makes neighborhoods more effective places for the people who live in, is a story about assets that weren't connected that became connected. So that for our listeners, the connective process and enhancing that possibility while understanding the difference in functions is, I think, how an ABCD orientation addresses this question.
I would just add to that, second the motion. And, we're so preoccupied with scale and size. But what John is showing us is the importance of connectivity. And now there are some good studies out that show For example, the power of networking, which is just association to association. And in the corporate world, even networking has allowed some businesses and enterprises to be much more effective. There's a nice book out called The Starfish and the Spider, which points out the advantages of networks and connectivity over scale. So rather than worrying about whether there are 100 people in a forum or not, it's the connectivity in it that makes the difference. And it's the glue that you want to pay attention to, not just the size.
And also understanding, I call it what's in scope and out of scope. So understanding the role of government, and that there are boundaries and things that they can and can't do. And same with associations, they have mandates, and then you've got citizens. So when you're trying to work together, you have to understand each other's role and what are the boundaries. Because going in and expecting the government to do everything and change everything is not going to happen. And so that comes to understanding, and that's trust and relationship again, and why it's so important. There's another question here about how does this approach address or account for intersectionality?
Intersectionality, divisiveness, devising. We've looked at that quite carefully because I'll use the word divided or divisive. It can be sectional, it can be racial, it can be economic, any other thing. And we were looking at people deliberating in forums. Here was a problem. There were several options for solving it. Each option had an attractive side and an unattractive side. There were pros and cons. They were in tension with one another. And there were some options or things that people very much did not like. So what we wondered was, how do they come to even respect or listen to a point of view that's very different, or an option that they don't care about? And what we found was what in our research we call a pivot. I'll give you a very graphic story. I think you may have heard it. And one of these forums, it was on abortion, very controversial. And this young woman was adamant in opposing abortion. But then at a moment, she confessed that she had had one. And the agony and personal trauma of that didn't change people's minds who were opposed, but they became open to it because they realized that this was a much more complex problem. This was a human problem. And so in forums on these and other issues, we found that in the process of trying to make a decision, if people pay attention to other stories, not facts, not arguments, but human stories, they become less divided. There's a story, there's a study in Finland on divisive issues that comes to the same conclusion.
There's a question here, and convince is in capitals. So how do we convince institutions, governments to give power to people and work with people if they're resistant to giving up their power? So I think this goes to one of the questions we were going to talk about, is what can we do as individuals, as citizens, to encourage this?
You can't convince them, and you should. But you can appeal to their self-interest. I can't report having much success with being able to convince people. You have to give up what you're doing. You have to accept what I say. That's just, people just don't. Human beings do not naturally agree. Agreement is an unnatural act. Right? What people can do, though, is see a connection between something that needs to be done in their own interest. And if you want to change the behavior of institutions, show them that there are things that can benefit them as they understand them. To understand that citizens can contribute something that I don't now have appeals to self-interest, and self-interest is a powerful motivator.
And David, living example, it's very current in the United States, is if you talk to police chiefs of bigger cities, one of the things that impresses us is how often when they are confronted with too much violence, too much crime, they will very often say, we have some responsibility, but there are real limits to what we can do. And the real determinant of whether or not this kind of violence is going to end has to do with what the community will do, which is what the social science researchers are finding. So you do find in, for instance, that group of leaders, a very clear recognition that if they are accountable for reducing crime, then local community action is going to be more effective than their action, and they then see their self-interest in supporting community approaches to dealing with security. And we're collecting stories about that from police leaders, how they see the need for communities to do their part.
Yes, we're working with them too on framing it. But the challenge is we were working with an organization that represents school superintendents. All right, they are like chiefs of police. They are just under the gun, constantly pounded to do this, do that, do the other. But they are so overwhelmed right now. It's very difficult for them to take advantage of the fact that policemen cannot provide all safety, teachers cannot provide all education, doctors cannot provide all health, and there are resources available in communities that can help them. But getting them, traumatized as they are sometimes, to reach out is a stretch. It's possible, and we're getting a few, notably in the police ranks. They are much more flexible than other, much more receptive than other professions.
Yes.
I'm just looking at the time, but I do want to, there was a quote here from one of our participants. Our democracy structures needs to shift to be more inclusive of BIPOC and women in the grassroots structures all the way up to the top. That will help carry democratic values through to the next century. So just wanted to.
You noted that the first word in democracy is the demos. It refers to the citizenry, the residents of a village, actually a Doric village. It makes no distinction amongst those citizens.
So I just wanted to leave with some thoughts. And what I got from your book and from what we heard today is that we need better alignment. You know, some of the best possible opportunities for better alignment occur when citizens and professionals are doing the same thing, but doing it differently. Right. To work with citizens, you know, a WIS strategy reinforces what our institutions are trying to do, but can't do alone. To recognize different ways of working, governing organizations identify the problems using cost-benefit analysis, and citizens use public deliberation, and they both have benefits. To see citizens as producers, people who make things to benefit the common good. So those are some of the key things I'd like to leave everybody with. I highly recommend, if you haven't read it yet, to read the book, go to the Kettering Foundation. I feel like it's a gold mine. I am so excited I found the website and have been diving really deep, and you can get lost in all the great work and resources and books that are there. And I just want to leave you with that we did record this. and we will be sending you out a post email. There are a lot of questions in here, and I'd like to do a shout out to Dr. Trevor Hancock, because I know he posted quite a few questions in here, and I'm going to see if we can get some responses afterwards and send it out. Some of them were for you, John. And just go to our website, tamarack.ca, to the deepening community. We have lots of resources and tools there. We are trying to build a movement, which I think we are actually at the movement phase across Canada. We have almost 8,000 learners and 28 members who are trying to develop neighborhood strategies. And to develop a neighborhood strategy, you got to work with. And with governments, with institutions, organizations, associations, and individuals. And we also have a podcast, and we just launched one with John McKnight, talking about what is the heart of ABCD. So for those of you who asked what ABCD is, Asset-Based Community Development, there's a podcast waiting for you to learn more. With that, I think this is the first time I have finished on time. So thank you so much for coming and joining us in this great discussion, and hope you have a wonderful day wherever you are in the world.